Hello and welcome to Global Eye. I'm Parikshit Luthra. The prominent focus at COP28 has been the dilemma over phase out or phase down of fossil fuels. UN Secretary General has urged leaders to plan for a future without fossil fuels, adding that it is the only way to save the planet. This comes a day after COP28 President Sultan Al Jaber emphasized on engaging with fossil fuel companies to phase out emissions. Prime Minister Modi proposed to host COP33 in India in 2028. He also called on all nations to work together to cut global emissions drastically. On day one, leaders arrived at a consensus on the Loss and Damage Fund, the plan which was first introduced at COP27. The fund will provide financial assistance to poor nations that are vulnerable to the impact of climate change. Italy has pledged $142 million towards the fund. COP28 host UAE and Germany have pledged $100 million each. Meanwhile, the UK has pledged $2 billion towards the Green Climate Fund. Joining me now to take this discussion forward are Navdeep Suri, former ambassador to UAE and distinguished fellow at the ORF, Vaibhav Chaturvedi, fellow at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, and Kate Hampton, CEO at Children's Investment Fund. Let me begin with you, Vaibhav Chaturvedi. Give us the major priorities and concerns that the Indian government is participating in this COP.
Great, thank you. Very good evening to all. First of all, the Prime Minister already laid out some very, very important things in his speech. The first thing he talked about was the importance of global climate justice and equity in carbon budget allocation. So he very clearly mentioned those terms. So in terms of narrative, essentially, climate justice and equity is absolutely important for India. The second thing is that he emphasized was the importance of finance. And what he very interestingly said, that it is not about billions. The time for billions is over. We are talking about trillions. That's the need of the hour. We are thinking about essentially a lot more climate finance for the buckets or various buckets of mitigation, adaptation, as well as loss and damage. But the language is of trillions, not of billions anymore. And I think something very interesting that he talked about was the green credit scheme. Right? So green credit is another incentive mechanism, essentially. We have been talking about carbon markets for long, very successful instrument, but carbon market looks only at the carbon value and nothing beyond it. For example, biodiversity conservation, water conservation, many of those things. Carbon doesn't really talk about those. The green credit scheme could kind of incentivize sustainable actions in a lot of kind of beyond carbon kind of sectors. And those are the very important things that India talked about. Finance is big. We hope to see some progress. A good progress on loss and damage already happened today. But still a lot of contributions to the fund are still voluntary in nature. Right? So great moment to celebrate, no doubt about it. But as I said, the contributions which are in millions, and the Prime Minister talked about trillions, the contributions are voluntary in nature. Great start, but at some point it has to be institutionalized because we're talking about sustainable kind of sustainable finance flowing into this fund, loss and damage fund, as well as it should have there should be some replenishment capability. So that is very important for continuous support to the most vulnerable economies on the loss and damage front. So these are some of the elements that are very important to India, shaping the kind of climate justice and equity debate, international climate finance, plus the green trade scheme, among the many other things that he talked about. Also, life is something that he has been emphasizing, lifestyle for the environment. That is something that he also talked about. Essentially, better behavior in terms of sustainable actions. That could lead to a lot lesser energy demand and footprint on the resources that we continue to consume across the world.
Vaibhav, I'll return to you now in a bit. I'll take a set of questions and come back to you. Ambassador Navdeep Suri, to get you in at this point, there is a strong bilateral agenda to this visit as well. There are 7 or 8 key bilateral meetings taking place. But when it comes to pressure on phasing out fossil fuels, you had the UN Secretary General saying 1.5-degree limit is only possible if we ultimately stop burning out fossil fuels, not reduce or abate, but phase out. What kind of resistance do you think we will see from some of the other developing nations? And could this COP actually give an exit, a clear roadmap for phasing out fossil fuels?
Parikshit, one of the things that has happened very actively in the last year is the manner in which we've used our G20 presidency to push some of these issues related to developing countries' concerns. The whole focus on green energy transitions, on climate finance, has been front and center of our G20 agenda. And I think what many people don't understand is, given how close our bilateral relationship with UAE is, the way we've tried to dovetail some of our outcomes into COP28. Let me give you an example. The Observer Research Foundation was steering the think tank the T20 track. And earlier this month, we had an event in Abu Dhabi, which was kind of a G20 handover to COP28 with a call for action. And Dr. Sultan Al Jaber, the president for COP28, came for that event to make his commitments to developing nations. So I think it's something which India has done particularly well over the last year, is to have kind of emerged as the voice articulating the concerns of the global South, whether it is on coal, whether it is on equity, whether it is on the justice in an energy transition, or indeed on climate finance. I just want to, in the course of last year, Dr. Sultan Al Jaber probably came to India half a dozen times to make sure that the G20, in a very unique pathway, was feeding into a COP28 on the climate agenda. And just one other point to add to what Vaibhav was saying about loss and damage fund. I think one of the most exciting things that I've heard today, and the details are probably still being fleshed out, is the UAE president in his speech committed $30 billion to a blended finance fund, which could catalyze up to $250 billion of investment into climate solutions. And this is something that we've been hearing from UAE side over and over again, that, instead of lamenting that the developed countries haven't done enough, can we be more creative and add to that, supplement that with private finance through some of these arrangements that seem to be emerging at this COP?
Right. Ambassador, I'd also like to ask you about Qatar. Qatar is present. Qatar Emir is there at the COP28. Do you think, this has not been specified by India, but do you think a meeting between the Indian Prime Minister and the Qatari Emir is quite possible in light of what has happened with the former Indian Navy personnel?
I'm not aware of it. I'm not in the loop on this. These are things that are sometimes raised through the diplomatic channels, and if a meeting happens, it's good. But I think, if there were a meeting, probably we would want some kind of an assurance from the Qatari side that there would be a measure of fairness and compassion in terms of dealing with the unfortunate situation of our naval officers.
Right. Let me go back to Dr. Vaibhav. Vaibhav, I would like to ask you about some of the other announcements that have been made, specifically by the UAE on a $30 billion global climate solutions fund, a climate-focused investment vehicle. How significant is this compared to other climate investment funds that we have across the world?
Well, I think the climate debate is now viewed into different buckets now: mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. And there are different kinds of investment vehicles and instruments are needed for all of these, because these are very, very different things altogether, right? The loss and damage fund we have already talked about. Both on adaptation and loss and damage, getting private finance is very tricky, because there is no return to private capital in any kinds of intervention. Like most of the interventions related to adaptation or loss and damage. So the only way, the big impact of private capital will be to accelerate the transition. Accelerate the energy transition, which is essentially talking about mitigation. So the catalytic fund, what I expect is, first of all, it's very important because we know public finance will lead to kind of catalyze the private finance, as already been announced by the leaders. And that's why in the larger schematic of things, this is you could say one country's effort. And it is, of course, the demand of mitigation and acceleration on mitigation actions is a lot more. The G20 declaration also clearly says that for developing countries to achieve their NDCs by 2030, almost $5.8 trillion US are required. So it's a pretty big money that is kind of required.
All right.
And anything that any of these rich countries do is going to be very, very important. What the Saudis have done is a very welcome step. The important part is many other countries need to join hands together. Many in the rich countries have to join hands together to enhance this particular pool. And as I said, the finance debate, just because we have made great progress on the pretty good progress on the loss and damage front, does not mean there's great progress on the mitigation front. So we have to think about all of these separately in some way. So mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, and yes, on mitigation, it's a great thing that Saudis have done, and hopefully many countries will follow suit.
All right. The Prime Minister has also spoken about a green credit initiative. Let me go across to Kate Hampton of the Children Investment Fund. She's joining us from Dubai right now. Kate, thank you so much for joining us. Let me ask you about some of your expectations. If you had to judge the success of this COP 10 days later, what would be some of the items or 2 or 3 top agenda points that you would be looking at?
Well, I heard your previous speaker talk about the work that India had done in its G20 to really advance the energy transition, and the fact that different countries will move at different speeds, of course. But I think what we want to see here in response to the global stock take is a real commitment to triple renewables that India and other countries have supported, as well as increasing energy efficiency. One of the things that I think has been missing so far from the conversation is around methane and other so-called super pollutants. Those are the non-carbon dioxide gases, which you get from the oil and gas sector, you get from waste, and you get from agriculture. If we can peak fossil carbon and those non-CO2 gases, we'll achieve the objective that was outlined by the scientists. And so I think as we push into the end of the conference, what we need to see is some of these aspirations that have been outlined in the G20 and by a number of governments. We need to see these pushed into national policy. And the only way to do that is by scaling up finance, which is what Prime Minister Modi was talking about today.
Right. Do you feel the starting point of this COP has given hope that when it comes to climate financing, the world is ready to raise the ambition? We will have higher targets and a higher funding for climate finance at the end of this?
I'm hoping that's the case. I mean, we've already seen some countries put new money on the table. UAE has put 100 million on the table for loss and damage, which is a real breakthrough, matched by a number of European countries yesterday and today. We've also seen the launch of a financial framework today by the presidency, and a number of governments stood by that, saying that we need to reform the international financial institutions where trillions sit on the balance sheet, but they're not being well used. We need to sweat those balance sheets and bring down the cost of capital. The only way this transition will be affordable, and if we can increase the resilience of frontline communities, is if they have access to finance at an affordable cost, and therefore deploy the technologies and the practices they need. So finance is going to be a big deal. It continues to be contentious, but of course finance ministers and heads of state need to get involved, because the environment ministers that tend to run the COP process don't necessarily have that portfolio at home. So I would look at finance ministers for the legacy of this COP.
All right. One very quick question to Ambassador Navdeep Suri. India, the Prime Minister has pitched to host the COP33 in India. Ambassador Suri, the big message from this?
Well, 2 messages. One is that it's in line with India's rise on the global stage, and after G20, some of our other big initiatives, it really will put India center stage with its ambition on climate issues. But I really do hope that it'll also galvanize us to clean up our cities, Delhi and Mumbai, or wherever the COP33 will be held, so that we have a much cleaner air for our own citizens to breathe by the time the delegates arrive into India.
All right, we've run out of time, but Dr. Vaibhav, Ambassador Suri and Kate, thank you so much for joining us here on News Center, giving us your view on the COP28 summit in Dubai and what has been achieved so far and the road over the next 10 days or so. We're heading into a short break, but coming up, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken says he's looking forward to seeing results after India announced a high-level probe into an alleged plot to murder a Sikh separatist in New York. Details when we are back.